What's up, everyone? I'm Tim. This is my channel 40 Times Around, where we talk about everything related to motorcycles, camping, travel, and adventure. Today we're hanging out in Big Bend State Park on a motorcycle camping trip, and we're going to be talking about how to diagnose a motorcycle that won't work. Just some tips and tricks and general guidelines and some things to help you through the process of hopefully avoiding calling a tow truck or at least sending it to the repair shop with the right complaint. We're going to jump into it right after this. So the first thing I want to talk about is the type of symptoms. These are going to be the abnormal conditions that help you identify a problem with your motorcycle. We all hope that when we venture off on our bike, everything runs smoothly and works as expected and as advertised, but that's not always the case. That's why it's important to kind of learn to recognize the different types of symptoms, because this is a good place to start when it comes to fixing a bike that doesn't want to work. The first type of symptom is a constant failure. This is going to be an issue that is always present. These are typically actually going to be a lot easier to identify the cause. The second type of symptom is going to be intermittent. This means the problem comes and goes, and it can be far more difficult to diagnose, but not impossible. So next I want to talk about 4 simple steps to remember when it comes to diagnosing a motorcycle. And then we're going to talk about 5 tips to help you through the process. So as far as the 4 steps go, step number 1 is to verify the problem. Number 2, isolate that problem. Number 3 is solve and repair the problem. Number 4 is to verify that the problem was solved correctly. Something to keep in mind is that you want to start with the easiest stuff and work your way up to the more complicated to repair issues. Don't skim over the obvious. Most manufacturers have troubleshooting guides in the back of their manuals. They're going to help you identify the symptom and potential causes for it. This is a really handy tool to have in your toolkit. Okay, now I'm going to give you 5 tips to help you through the process. Tip number 1 is to think the problem through. In other words, don't just start reacting to the situation, but rather take some time to analyze and consider what might be going wrong, what might be causing it before you start taking things apart. Tip number 2 is don't overlook the obvious. In other words, don't start diagnosing an issue with your engine if you haven't checked to make sure that you have fuel, that you have the key or the ignition switch on. You know, we've all done it. It happens to the best of us. We forget to, turn the kill switch on, and we're wondering why our bike won't start and scratching our head thinking my engine's messed up or the battery's dead or this, that, or the other thing. So don't overlook the obvious. Tip number 3 is don't assume anything. Again, like I just said, don't assume a motorcycle has fuel in it until you've checked. Tip number 4, when you're going through a process of diagnosing, don't take shortcuts. You'll end up having to backtrack to recheck things. And tip number 5, this is a big one, don't make more than one change or adjustment at a time. If you're methodical and thoughtful about this, most problems can be figured out and possibly solved, depending on what kind of tools you have with you and your mechanical knowledge. Remember, a motorcycle needs 3 things to operate: fuel, compression, and spark. Make sure you have those 3 things if your motorcycle won't start. Now, I recently had to diagnose an issue with my own motorcycle, and I'm going to tell you what the symptoms were, what I was experiencing, and then I'm going to talk you through the steps that I took to figure out what was wrong and what led me to realize my clutch was starting to slip. It seems like that would be an obvious problem, but it was actually not. And the reason for that was, what I know as a clutch slipping is, once I start suspecting maybe my clutch is slipping, I would get on the highway, go about 75, and then hammer on the throttle real hard. If the bike moves and there's no delay, your clutch probably isn't slipping. If your clutch was slipping, which I was experiencing a few years ago, my bike would it wouldn't go. The RPMs would climb up and the bike would just kind of be like, and then it would go. It was a very annoying problem to have on the highway when you're trying to pass a tractor trailer. And that's how I figured out I was slipping a clutch a few years ago now. That's what I was expecting to experience when I started thinking there was something wrong with my bike. Basically, I felt like I was losing power when I was taking off, and even on the highway, it just felt like I was revving higher than I needed to. But anytime I went, like I said, and checked, is my clutch slipping? I would go on the highway 75 miles an hour, hammer on the throttle, and every time I would feel a pull instantly. I would just move forward. Didn't seem to be lagging at all in the clutch department in that way. Now, before this had happened, I had taken my bike to get some work done. And normally I do all my own work, but when I'm due for a really big service, I just send it to the shop, let them take care of it, and let someone else put their eyes and hands on my motorcycle, at least just to get a second opinion or perspective from my own. So what they did was they changed my spark plugs, they did my valve job, oil change, final drive. Now, final drive definitely wouldn't have had much to do with what I was feeling. However, I did think once I started feeling an issue, maybe they did something wrong. So I looked at what they did, and oddly enough, in the service manual for my bike, these were all of the things they were saying to check for a lack of power or a loss of power. So I thought, okay, well, it doesn't seem like my clutch is slipping because when I'm on the highway, it's not slipping. It does seem like I'm losing power. So the next thing I started thinking was, okay, maybe it's a compression issue. So I pulled the spark plugs out. I checked that they were torqued down correctly, that there wasn't anything wrong with them, that they weren't fouled or any of that. And the spark plugs were great, and I torqued them down right. Still had the same issue. Next thing was the air filter. I pulled out the air filter, made sure there wasn't any dust in it, that my bike was breathing appropriately and wasn't suffocating from dust or anything like that, that the air filter was installed properly, and it was. As you can see, I started with the easier things. Before I went and pulled out my clutch, I verified that everything else was working correctly. In other words, that I wasn't losing compression, because it would have been a real shame to take my clutch out, because it's kind of a pain, and then find out my spark plugs were a little bit loose and I was losing compression. So we checked the obvious: spark plugs, air filter. The next thing I started thinking was maybe the valves were out of time. If they maybe didn't do the adjustment quite right, I could be losing a little bit of compression to my valves or something like that. So that was a relatively simple job, but not one that I actually wanted to do. There's condors flying all over me right now. Lost my train of thought there. So I decided to get on the bike, ride it again, and just evaluate the problem one more time. Try to identify more accurately what the symptom was that I was experiencing. So this is when I kind of came to terms with, yeah, I may have burnt out my clutch. I know exactly when it happened, and I suspected that I was doing some damage when it happened. For those of you that watch all my videos, you know that I do a fair amount of off-road riding, and I usually, or have always in my videos up until just recently, have had full-on street tires, which is normally not an issue for the places I go. It's a lot of fire access roads, some pretty rugged stuff, but if you take your time and you maintain momentum and you know what you're doing, it's not impossible. It can be done on street tires. I wanted to do street tires when I was learning off-road, so that when I did switch to a knobbier tire, I'd be much better off for it. But sometimes I get in a little over my head. I get into a situation that I have no business being in with street tires. And on this particular day, it happened to be mud, but it didn't look like mud from a distance. It looked like hard ground. There was grass and everything, and it was just like a smooth track down this trail. And I went in about 10 feet. I started feeling my rear wheel slip, and I started slowing down even though I was maintaining throttle, and I came to a stop and I sank in almost immediately. What I realized quickly was that it wasn't just mud, it was clay, and the suction on this was so immense and so powerful that it took me roughly 2.5 hours to turn my bike around and go 10 feet back out of the mud. And the only way I could do that was by slipping the clutch, tipping the bike over, pulling it out of the rut, standing it back up, slipping the clutch over and over again for 2.5 hours until I got out of there. So I had a feeling I was doing some damage when all of that happened, and apparently I was. So from here forward, I think it's a worthwhile investment for me to run some tires with at least a little more grip in case I find myself in that situation again. Long story short, I ended up replacing my clutch with something aftermarket, and I'm going to be getting into that in a video very soon. I've actually already replaced the clutch, so I know that was the issue because everything's working fine now. But like I said, I'm going to be talking about that in a future video. So that was kind of how I diagnosed that problem, how I figured it out, and walked through all the steps. Anyways, that's it for today. I hope you got something out of this video. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell if you haven't already. That way you don't miss anything whenever I post something new about motorcycles, camping, travel, and adventure. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.